In 2008, a quiet convent in upstate New York abruptly closed its doors, with officials citing financial strain, but whispers told of a young nun who disappeared the night before without explanation. 13 years later, a plumber uncovers a sealed chamber beneath the old chapel, triggering a chain of revelations that will expose the terrifying truth buried beneath decades of silence. The morning light flickered across the cracked floor tiles of St. Mary's. The convent of St. Mary of Providence had stood in a quiet corner of upstate New York for nearly 8 decades. It wasn't large, nor particularly beautiful. Its bricks weather-warmed, its stained glass faded from decades of harsh winters and humid summers. But to the locals of Hollow Pines, a town barely scraping 4,000 residents, it was a fixture. A place of peace, mystery, and, for those old enough to remember, caution. In 2008, when the doors of the convent were abruptly shuttered, few outside the town paid attention. The diocese issued a brief statement citing sustainable financial burden and the diocese limitations of the remaining sisters. The local newspaper ran a short column. A few elderly parishioners attended the final mass, and then, like that, it was over. But to some in Hollow Pines, especially those with long memories, the closure wasn't just sad, it was disturbing. The convent had a history. It was once rumored to have been tied to a defunct rehabilitation school for girls in the 1960s, a euphemism, many suspected, for what had really gone on: forced labor, severe discipline, silence. The records were sealed. The building that housed the school had been demolished long before, but the whispers never stopped. The convent had absorbed the last remaining staff of that school in the late 70s. Elderly nuns with opaque pasts and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Most locals stayed away, out of discomfort more than disdain. It wasn't that they believed every horror story. They just couldn't shake the feeling that something about St. Mary's was. The night before the convent closed for good, a storm rolled in from the mountains. Rain pounded the slate roof, lightning illuminating the sky in brief, jarring flashes. Inside the convent, Sister Camilla moved silently down the long hallway that led to the chapel. At 27, she was the youngest nun in residence by nearly 40 years. Soft-spoken and devout, she'd been assigned to St. Mary's 2 years earlier. Most of the older nuns viewed her with a kind of distant tolerance, as if unsure what to make of her optimism and insistence on modernization. She had started recording financial discrepancies, questioning old routines, and worst of all, talking about reopening parts of the building long sealed off. She didn't fit. That night she was never seen again. The morning after, the remaining 6 sisters were waiting in the courtyard when the truck from the diocese arrived. The staff who came to assist with closure were told that Sister Camilla had left in the night, likely returned to her family. No one questioned it too deeply. No one wanted to. The building was emptied within 48 hours. Crucifixes, hymnals, pews, relics, all removed or sold. By the end of the week, the heavy wooden doors were bolted shut. A simple sign was nailed to the front gate: "Closure until further notice." But the real notice, the real silence, came from those who knew Sister Camilla, who wondered why she hadn't called, emailed, or even sent a letter. Her family said they hadn't heard from her. Her former parish in Buffalo confirmed she never returned. Her name was never mentioned again. Some say the diocese paid for silence. Others suggest Camilla chose to disappear. A few, mostly older women from the town who had cleaned the convent in their youth, whispered a darker theory, that she had discovered something she wasn't meant to. Over the years, vines climbed over the outer walls. The windows fogged with grime. Local real estate agents quietly avoided listing it, even as the market grew tight. The building sat, silent, decaying, like it was waiting for something. Or someone. Then in the summer of 2021, the property was purchased by the Hollow Pines Housing Project with plans to convert it into a shelter and community kitchen. Construction crews arrived, peeling back the decades of neglect, but no one had any idea that below the foundation, beneath decades of stone and silence, something had been hidden. Something that started, or perhaps ended, the night Sister Camilla vanished. By the summer of 2021, St. Mary of Providence was no longer a convent, at least not in name. The exterior still bore the weathered brick and overgrown ivy of years past, but now the structure buzzed with the activity of hammers, ladders, and contractors. After over a decade of neglect, the building had been purchased by Hollow Pines Housing Project, a nonprofit aiming to convert abandoned religious structures into transitional shelters. For many in the town, it was a second chance, for the building and for people like Charles Chuck Minter, a former machinist turned long-term transient whose weathered face and slow limp made him seem older than his 62 years. Chuck had lived in Hollow Pines on and off since the 90s, his life dissolving slowly after a plant layoff and a series of bad breaks. He was among the first to take up residence in the newly renovated St. Mary's Community Shelter when opened that fall. The first floor had been transformed into a dormitory and cafeteria. The chapel turned into a multi-purpose room with folding chairs and acoustic panels. The second floor was still under construction, and the upper bell tower remained closed for safety. The basement, or what was accessible of it, housed the boiler room and some old storage, but a portion remained off-limit behind a reinforced steel door bolted with industrial locks. The housing project director, a no-nonsense woman named Laurie DeWitt, had told the residents that section was just an old maintenance corridor full of asbestos and structural risks. She was firm and well-meaning, but Chuck didn't buy it. He'd been around long enough to know when someone was avoiding a question. It started the second week he was there. Chuck had always been a light sleeper, a side effect of years spent in shelters, on benches, in his truck, and finally in encampments under I-83. So when he heard the sound, faint at first, like a soft whisper, he chalked it up to pipes or the creaking of old wood. But as the nights passed, the sounds became clearer, muffled voices, weeping, a low murmur of words that sounded like prayers, half Latin, half whispers. It started around 2:13, AUMing each night, and ended just before 3. He told himself it was his mind playing tricks, but by the 5th night he was sure. The sound was coming from behind the locked basement corridor. Chuck mentioned it one morning during breakfast, his voice quiet but deliberate as he sipped instant coffee in a styrofoam cup. A few residents looked up, but most kept their heads down. It was Brenda, a former nurse with a shaved head and unblinking eyes, who responded. "I heard it too," she said. "The crying, the voices. You're not imagining it." Chuck nodded, not reassured. "You ever ask Lorraine?" Brenda scoffed. "She says we're hearing things. PTSD, meds, the usual excuses." That evening, Chuck decided to see for himself. He waited until the night crew was out of sight and slipped down the narrow stairwell to the basement. The air grew colder the further he descended, heavy with moisture and something more subtle, mildew maybe, or the metallic scent of rust and stone. At the far end of the boiler room was the locked door. It looked newer than the surrounding fixtures, as if it had been installed more recently than the original architecture. A padlock the size of his fist hung from a chain looped through the handles. He pressed his ear against the cold metal and waited. At first, nothing. "Here's something in that basement," he said, eyes locked on hers. "Someone." Lorraine's face remained neutral. "Chuck, we've had inspectors go down there. There's nothing. It's just an old access tunnel, some walls have collapsed, and the area's not safe. That's why we locked it. If you're hearing things, I can refer you to Dr. Heller." Tree's trained in trauma counseling. A lot of residents struggle with. "I'm not struggling with anything," Chuck interrupted, voice low but firm. "I've heard voices for 6 nights straight. I'm not the only one." Lorraine's expression flickered then, just for a second, a crack in the facade. "I'll have maintenance check it again," she said, and turned away. But Chuck noticed something. She didn't ask what the voices said. Didn't ask when or how often, like she already knew. That night Chuck didn't sleep. He sat on his cot, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the clock to strike 2:13. When it did, he didn't go to the basement. He listened. The voices came again, louder this time, the sobs more distinct, the prayers now clearly repeated in a pattern, almost distinct. One voice repeated a name over and over, Camilla. The next morning, Brenda didn't show up for breakfast. One of the staff said she'd checked out early, no explanation. But Chuck knew better. That name, Camilla, lingered in his mind. He didn't know why it mattered, only that it did. He spent the afternoon in the makeshift common room, using the community desktop computer. Searching St. Mary of Providence Camilla disappearances led nowhere, but then he typed St. Mary of Providence None missing 2008. The screen loaded an old archived article from a Buffalo Diocese's newsletter. Sister Camilla Hargrove, 27, presumed to have left St. Mary's of her own volition after the convent's closure. No foul play suspected. There was a grainy photo of a young woman with auburn hair and a nervous smile. The same name from the basement. The same name no one in the shelter had mentioned. Chuck printed the article and slid it into his jacket. He returned to the basement that evening, stood in front of the locked corridor, and read the name aloud. The weeping stopped. For the first time in days, the basement was silent. He stepped back, heart hammering. Then came a new sound, soft, metallic, unmistakable. The padlock moved. 3 days after the incident with the moving padlock, Chuck sat in the courtyard, watching the gray November sky sag low over hollow pines. His mind looped through everything: Camilla's name, the crying, the moment of silence after he spoke it aloud, and the undeniable shift of that steel lock. Lorraine hadn't mentioned anything about it since, and Chuck wasn't sure if she even knew what had happened that night. But someone else had entered the picture. That morning, a local plumbing contractor named Mason DeLuca arrived in a white service van marked DeLuca & Sons, Residential and Historical Plumbing, since 1982. Lorraine had brought him in quietly, saying the staff noticed drops in water pressure and old piping acting up again. Chuck noticed she didn't bring her usual clipboard and avoided eye contact with most of the residents. He had a feeling Mason wasn't here just for a leaky faucet. Mason, 39, with rolled sleeves and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, was used to being called in for church basements, century-old courthouses, and rotting libraries across the county. He liked old buildings, their hidden corners, the strange logic behind their construction, so when Lorraine pointed him toward the boiler room and gave him a vague mention of possible seepage in the southeast quadrant, he nodded without asking too many questions. He brought his flashlight, pry tools, and moisture meter and descended into the belly of the old convent. The basement was colder than expected, the air dense with a stale dampness that clung to his clothes. As he traced the old copper piping along the eastern wall, he noticed a section of floor that sounded off when tapped with his boot, more hollow than the rest. That alone wouldn't have raised eyebrows, but Mason saw something else, a faint outline, like a square frame beneath the tile, just beneath a row of mismatched ceramic pieces, the kind used in rushed patch jobs. The grout lines were uneven, barely visible, as if someone had tried to make it look like the original tiling without actually matching the material. Curious, he set down his wrench, pulled a small utility blade from his tool belt, and began working at the grout. The tiles came loose with alarming ease, too easily, for something that should have been decades old. Within minutes, a square wooden panel was exposed. It had a small inset iron handle, nearly flush with the wood, the kind used for attic hatches or storm cellars. Mason ran his fingers along the edge. The handle was old, but not ancient. Someone had accessed it in recent years. He paused, considering whether he should notify Lorraine. But his gut told him she already knew about this, so instead he took a breath, slipped his fingers under the iron grip, and pulled. The panel groaned as it opened, the dusk swirling into the air. Beneath it, a narrow stairwell descended into darkness. The steps were concrete, rough and uneven, the kind poured hastily without concern for finish. The air that escaped from below smelled of cold stone and something metallic, like old blood or rusted iron. He pulled out his flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it into the void. The light barely reached the bottom, but it was enough to show that the stairs didn't end quickly. They went deep, very deep. Mason hesitated only a second longer, then lowered himself slowly into the space, 1 foot after the other, testing each step for stability. The walls were lined with crude cement, damp and pockmarked. As he descended, he noted that the temperature dropped sharply. He counted each step aloud, 13 in total, before the stairwell opened into a small chamber. The room was rectangular, maybe 10 by 15 feet, with no windows and a single rust-covered drain in the center of the floor. The walls were bare save for a rotted wooden bench pressed against the far side and a few hooks embedded in the stone, hanging empty. In one corner lay a small pile of cloth, mildewed, half-rotted, but unmistakably robes. Nun robes. Mason's skin prickled. He swept his flashlight slowly across the walls again, this time catching something in the far corner. faint lettering carved into the concrete. Latin. He didn't understand all of it, but he recognized parts. Domini, mea culpa, serva, me. Lord, my fault, save me. He stepped toward the center, where the drain sat flush with the cement. It was ringed with brown stains that didn't look like rust. Mason knelt down, ran his hand along the perimeter, and felt something rough beneath his fingertips. Grooves scratched into the floor around the drain. They were too deliberate to be damage from water. More like marks from fingernails. He stood quickly, backing toward the stairs. His breath echoed unnaturally, like the room was absorbing sound. Turning off the flashlight made the dark absolute. He flicked it back on, then climbed the steps 2 at a time until he was back in the boiler room. Mason replaced the tiles over the hatch, shoved the loosened pieces aside, and sat down against the wall. He was shaking, though he didn't know why. He'd worked in cemeteries, storm shelters, even old prison basements. But this wasn't a place people were meant to return to. Upstairs, Lorraine was on the phone when Mason approached. "I need to talk to you," he said firmly. She excused herself from the call, eyes scanning his face. "What did you find?" He hesitated, watching her reaction. "A room, under the floor, not on your building plans." She didn't flinch. "Did you go inside?" "Yes," Mason said. "There's something down there, something wrong." Lorraine folded her arms. "It's been sealed for a reason, Mr. DeLuca. We're doing good work here. What's down there is past. Let it stay that way." He studied her. "You already knew, didn't you?" Lair's jaw tensed. "Just patch it up. Send me the invoice. And don't mention this to anyone." Mason left the building, but not before slipping the cloth from the basement into a sealed bag. That night he sat in his garage, staring at the robe under the harsh fluorescent light. It was stained, threadbare, but the embroidery on the collar was clear. Camilla. As he reached for his phone to make a call, the bag twitched, nose shifted, and he froze. But it was only the cloth settling. He picked up his phone again and stopped. Something about the basement kept pressing on his mind, the Latin words, the drain, the hooks. And that bench. It wasn't a bench. It was a cot. And under it, he hadn't looked. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. The image of the concrete room beneath St. Mary's etched itself into his mind like a scar. Its walls, its silence, the way the air had felt wrong, like it had memory. He tried to convince himself that Lorraine's words were just an administrative dismissal, but her eyes had told a different story, one of Nobe, perhaps guilt. At 317 Haywalk's garage, robe still sealed in the plastic bag on his workbench, something compelled him to go back, not for money, not for obligation. Curiosity wasn't even the right word. It was closer to instinct, a sense that the place hadn't told its full story yet. He packed his flashlight, gloves, and a compact crowbar, then drove the 10 minutes back to the shelter in silence, the old van rattling like a whisper. The building loomed darker at night, the glow of the parking lot lights barely touching the stained brick. He parked in the far corner, crept around to the basement side entrance, and used the key Lorraine had given him, still in his pocket from the job. Inside, the boiler room was quiet, humming faintly from the old water heater's effort to maintain pressure. He slid aside the tiles, pried open the wooden hatch, and descended once more into the forgotten stairwell. When he reached the bottom, he took a longer look at the room. The first time, the strangeness of it had overwhelmed him. The smell, the dampness, the palpable stillness. Now, with a steadier light and fewer nerves, he noticed more. The bench in the corner was not for rest. It was a frame, a metal cot bolted into the floor, narrow and rust-streaked, with remnants of a thin mattress so decayed it had fused with the frame. Mason stepped closer and saw 2 iron rings welded into the floor on either side of the cot's base. He traced the outline with his glove. Shackles. Someone had been restrained here. Above the cot, carved into the wall with what looked like a nail or similar tool, were repeated images, crude crosses, circles containing Latin inscriptions, even a few eye symbols that felt more like desperate warnings than theology. Most of them had been blackened with what appeared to be charcoal, smeared by hand, as if the artist had tried to make them bolder, more visible. To the left of the cot was a chain, looped through another wall anchor, ending in a shackle no bigger than a woman's wrist. It had rusted stiff, but the shape was unmistakable. On the opposite wall, someone had written directly into the cement in large, blocky letters. Or me, execution, Mundi Vidi Americare. Mason snapped a photo with his phone. He didn't know Latin, but something about those words, carved like a mission statement, sent chills through him. He moved to the corner where the pile of cloth had lain. As he pushed it aside, the floor beneath it creaked ever so slightly, not the creak of concrete, but of something hollow beneath weight. He knelt, pushing back the fabric further, and uncovered a wooden floor panel, water-stained and swollen from time. With effort, he slid it aside and revealed a small crawl space. It wasn't deep, barely a couple feet down, but at the bottom lay a metal tin box, green with rust, the kind used to store documents or tools. He pulled it out slowly, the hinges nearly breaking from age, and pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped in a damp cloth, was a small journal. Its cover was cracked leather, warped by moisture, and the first few pages were stuck together. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was jagged, frantic, as if written in haste or under duress. The ink had bled in places, but some words were legible. The first entry was dated August 2nd, 2007. "Bills have begun again," it read. "She is young. She doesn't know. I tried to warn her, but I was too late." Mason flipped forward. Many entries mentioned Camilla by name. "She asked too many questions," one page read. "She thinks she can stop them. She doesn't know what this place was built for." Another entry, dated just weeks before the convent's closure, described something called the Purification, a ritual involving seclusion, silence, confession without consent. "They say it is to cleanse the soul, but there is no soul left when they finish," Mason read with growing unease. The term tinctura coacta appeared repeatedly, forced penance. One passage was underlined twice. They said she had to be broken to be saved. She screamed for 3 nights. Then silence. His hands trembled as he turned to the final entry. "Camilla is gone. I saw the door close. I heard the hymn, and then nothing. I buried this in case someone ever comes. This place is not holy. It was never holy." There was no name on the cover, but one signature at the bottom of the last page. Chris sat back on his heels. The name wasn't familiar, but it confirmed something vital. This room, this chamber, hadn't forgotten. It had been hidden purposefully, and at least one person inside had known it was wrong. He scanned the room one last time. There was no light fixture, no switch, only the drain, the cot, the chain, and the wall screaming silently with prayers that no one answered. He stood and placed the journal into his bag. As he turned to leave, the flashlight caught something on the back wall he hadn't noticed before. An old wooden plaque nailed at shoulder height, barely visible beneath layers of grime. He stepped closer and wiped away the dirt. Etched into the plaque, almost lovingly, were the words, "Silence is salvation." The edges had scratch marks around them, small crescents, as if someone had dug at it with fingernails. Mason climbed the stairs slowly, the journal heavy in his pack. Above ground, the world was just beginning to wake. The sky was lightening over the trees, and birds called out to each other in the distance. As he walked to his van, he didn't notice the figure watching from the third-floor window, where no resident was supposed to be. The figure's face was shadowed, expression unmoving, silent, like the plaque had promised. Back at his workshop the following afternoon, Mason sat at his drafting table with the journal open in front of him, the pages weighted down with a wrench to keep them from curling. Sunlight filtered through the small window, slicing the dusty air with golden beams. He had been staring at the same sentence for nearly an hour, reading it over and over again. Camilla screamed for 3 nights. His breath caught every time. But something else had started to gnaw at the edge of his thoughts. The handwriting. It had changed. The final 2 entries were in a different style, tighter spacing, neater lettering, the slant more upright, the pen pressure lighter. Mason had seen enough contractor forms and client signatures to know when someone switched hands. Or worse, when someone else picked up the pen. He reached for his phone and called a friend, Vanessa Truitt, a language teacher who dabbled in forensic handwriting as a hobby. 2 hours later she arrived, red curls tied in a loose bun and an overstuffed canvas bag slung over her shoulder. They laid the journal out carefully, Vanessa examining it under a magnifying lens. "This is strange," she muttered, flipping back and forth between the beginning and the end. "See this?" she pointed. "These last 2 pages, different author, or if it's the same person, a drastically different mental state." Mason leaned forward. "Can you tell if this matches any other sample? A signature, maybe?" Vanessa raised a brow. "That depends. Do you have anything to compare it to?" Mason hesitated, then pulled up the online archive from the diocesan newsletter again, the grainy photo of Sister Camilla, and beneath it, a scanned excerpt from a handwritten letter she had submitted as part of a charity drive in 2007. Vanessa tilted the screen toward herself and zoomed in. Her eyes moved back and forth between the journal and the image. Then she froze. "It's her," she said. "Same slope, same letter spacing. Look at the loops on the lowercase e and the tails on the graph." "That's a match." Mason's pulse jumped. "But the date on that journal entry is January 18, 2009. Camilla disappeared October 17, 2008. Then she was still alive, 3 months after the official disappearance." Mason leaned back, the air suddenly thick. "Or someone forged it," he said. Vanessa shook her head. "No, this isn't forged. This is personal. Whoever wrote this wasn't faking it. She was there." The next day, Mason drove to the county archives, a squat stone building attached to the old courthouse. He requested access to any incident reports or complaints from St. Mary of Providence dated between 2005 and 2008. The clerk, a bored middle-aged woman with chipped nail polish, typed reluctantly and handed over a single manila folder marked Clergy Oversight, Restricted Review. Mason opened it on the spot. Inside was a single complaint form, mostly redacted, dated July 2008. The complainant's name had been blacked out, but the initials CHH remained in the lower corner. The content was clearer. It alleged spiritual coercion, psychological torment, and unethical corrections of St. Mary. The form was stamped with a large red, "Closed internal review completed." No follow-up, no police involvement, nothing else. Mason took a photo of the form before returning it. Then he dug deeper, requesting any records related to Father Gerald Kane. The clerk found more: press releases, transfer notices, diocesan memos. Kane had been reassigned to a mission in South America in late 2008, just after the convent's closure. He retired quietly in 2012. Mason found a retirement article online with a quote that chilled him. "In every role I've held, I have been committed to the purification of faith." The word purification rang through his head again and again, like an echo off cold stone. He closed his laptop, left the archives, and sat in his van, trying to breathe. That night, unable to resist, he went back to the shelter. He needed to see the room again, but more than that, he needed to look beneath the cot. He hadn't checked the most obvious place. After sneaking into the basement, he pried up the mattress fragments with gloved hands and saw something wedged into the metal slats beneath. A worn cloth pouch tied with twine. Inside were only a few entries, all written in the same precise hand as the last pages of the previous journal. They were dated December 2008 through February 2009. The first entry: "They have taken my name. They call me penitent. I will not forget who I am." The second entry, dated January 2, 2009, "I tried to speak the truth. I wrote everything. I gave it to the bishop's office. Then they told me to reflect, to isolate, to fast and pray. But they never let me leave." The final entry was a single sentence, dated February 10, 2009. "I hear no footsteps above anymore. I think they forgot I am here." Mason clutched the notebook to his chest. The timing didn't make sense. The shelter had been empty for years before renovations. The building was locked, boarded up, utilities cut off. If Camilla had written this in 2009, it meant she had been kept there long after the convent closed. Long after anyone had claimed to see her. That level of concealment, weeks, months, it required cooperation. It required planning. And someone had buried that truth in layers of concrete and silence. Outside, the parking lot was quiet. The night air was sharp with winter chill. Mason stood alone, notebook in hand, mind racing. He thought of Lorraine, of her warning not to return, of the surveillance cameras installed only at the front entrance, not the back, of the fact that no one, not even the residents, were allowed past the boiler room. He walked to his van, but before he could open the door, a voice behind him said, softly, "You shouldn't have gone back down there." Mason froze. He turned slowly and found himself face to face with someone he hadn't seen in years. Someone who had no reason to be at a shelter. Someone who once wore a collar and spoke of discipline like it was salvation. The moment Mason turned to see the familiar face in the parking lot, a part of him resisted believing what he saw. The man standing before him, hands in the pockets of a long black overcoat, was none other than Father Gerald Kane, aged, slower perhaps, but still bearing the same sharp gaze and narrow frame. He was supposed to be in South America, long retired, if not dead. Mason's mouth dried as the cold night air thickened between them. "You remember me?" Kane asked calmly, his voice lower, older but disturbingly even. Mason didn't answer. Instead, his grip on the notebook in his coat pocket tightened. "I heard someone's been digging," Kane continued, stepping closer, eyes glinting under the amber glow of the parking lot lamp. "The past doesn't belong to everyone, Mr. DeLuca. Some doors should stay closed." Mason exhaled through his nose, voice controlled. "You were supposed to be gone." Kane's lips curled into something between a smirk and a warning. "We all return eventually," he said. And with that, he turned and walked off toward the tree line, disappearing into the dark like a ghost that had been watching all along. Mason drove home without speaking, his fingers twitching on the steering wheel the entire way. The next morning, unable to shake what had happened, he pulled an old cardboard box from the back of his workshop closet, a family keepsake chest that had belonged to his mother. Inside were photos, yellowing letters, a few rosaries, and at the very bottom, a small bound journal wrapped in wax paper. The name on the inside cover, Sister Margaret DeLuca, his great-aunt. She had died in 2001, shortly before Mason graduated high school. The family said she had lived in service for most of her life, stationed at St. Mary's for more than 2 decades. Mason had only vague childhood memories of visiting her, a quiet woman with kind eyes and a whisper-soft voice. As he leafed through the journal, he noticed most entries were mundane, prayers, reflections, notes on scripture, but near the end, her tone shifted. One entry, dated 1998, stood out. "I no longer recognize the rituals we are asked to perform. I do not believe they come from God." Mason's skin prickled. Another note, scribbled hastily on a torn page, read, "Gerald says it is cleansing. I say it is cruelty. He warns me to obey. I pretend." Mason leaned back, stunned. His great-aunt had known. She had been part of it. Or at least present. The words made it clear she struggled with what she'd witnessed, or done. And then he remembered something else. He raced back to the notebooks from the hidden chamber. Flipping to a passage in Camilla's journal, he scanned for the names she had written during the descriptions of the penitential rites. One in particular caught his eye now, with brutal clarity. Margaret D. guards the outer door. She never speaks during the process. She wears her crucifix turned backward. Mason dropped the book onto the table, his breath caught in his throat. It was his aunt. The kind woman with a soft voice who had baked Christmas cookies and whispered bedtime prayers. She had been the watcher, the guardian, the one who stood outside and listened as the rituals were carried out. Had she been complicit, trapped, afraid, or a believer in something twisted? The questions spiraled, multiplying faster than he could answer them. Mason knew he had to go deeper. He contacted the diocese, posing as a researcher looking into Catholic heritage sites, requesting historical floor plans of St. Mary's under the pretense of a preservation project. A week later, a package arrived, but neither included the stairwell, the underground chamber, or the extra room beneath the east wing. The omission was clear. Someone had hidden it from the start. He matched the hand-drawn maps to what he'd walked himself. The concrete bunker had been built between those years, post-1989, likely under private supervision. Someone had poured new foundations without permits. He reached out to a retired contractor named Saul Martin, who used to run city inspections for Hollow Pines. Over coffee, Mason showed him the photos he'd taken. Saul squinted, tapping one gnarled finger against the screen. "That ain't original construction," he muttered. "Look at the cement mix. It's different, poured on top of original base. Whoever did this wanted it sturdy, permanent." "You ever sign off on anything like this?" Mason asked. Saul shook his head slowly. "Not a chance. That kind of build would have needed a backdoor permit. Private church project, maybe. We used to let them through back in the day. Nobody wanted to argue with the cloth." Mason walked out of the diner and sat in his van, staring at the traffic. The weight of legacy, of family, bore down on him in ways he hadn't expected. His great-aunt had walked those same halls, heard those same screams. Now he was carrying her unfinished reckoning. A thought bloomed in his mind, uninvited but persistent. What if she had left something behind? A confession, a second journal, a final act of contrition? He had to find out. That night, Mason returned to the shelter. He entered through the front this time, nodded at the receptionist, and told her he needed to check a plumbing fixture one last time. No one questioned him. He descended into the basement and opened the hidden hatch again. The cold air met him like a shroud. The chamber was unchanged, silent, unfeeling. He returned to the spot beneath the cot, feeling along the inner ledge where the second notebook had been. Nothing. But then he remembered the carved plaque on the wall, the one with the scratched words, "Silence is salvation." He approached it slowly, running his fingers along its edges. There was a notch beneath the plaque, subtle but present. Mason slid the crowbar in and pried gently. With a soft crack, the wood popped free, revealing a narrow hollow. Inside was a leather envelope bound with red ribbon. He pulled it out, opened it carefully, and removed 3 sheets of parchment, folded neatly. They were brittle but legible. Each page bore the same handwriting as his aunt's journal. The first line read, "If you find this, I have failed in my silence." The second, "What we did in the name of God, we did in fear. But fear is not faith." The last page was a list, names, initials, dates. Mason's eyes scanned down and stopped cold at one. Camilla H., Oct. 2008, Right 47, deemed incomplete, held for reanimation. He stepped back from the wall, hands shaking. His aunt hadn't just witnessed it, she'd recorded it. The list confirmed what the journal only hinted at. Camilla hadn't vanished, she had been designated for something worse, something ongoing. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly above, but not from the main hallway. They came from within the building, inside, deeper, as if someone else had just entered the chamber from another direction. The moment Mason heard the footsteps echo through the chamber from beyond the far wall, his instincts flared. He quickly stuffed the envelope back into his coat, pressed the plaque into place, and turned off his flashlight. In the darkness, he held his breath, listening as the steps faded, then disappeared altogether. There was no sound of a door closing, no voice, no other movement. It was as if whoever had entered had vanished again into the stone. Mason remained still for minutes, the silence stretching until he could no longer tell how much time had passed. Eventually he climbed the stairs and exited the shelter into the thin pre-dawn fog that clung to Hollow Pines like a second skin. The sun had not yet risen when he returned to his workshop, laying out the documents from the holo behind the plaque. The list, the confessions, they were damning, yes, but incomplete. If Camilla had been marked as incomplete and never officially listed as deceased or even missing, in a criminal sense, then there was a chance, however remote, that she had survived. But where would they have taken her? He spent the next 2 days chasing threads, tracking the connections between the diocese, the convent, and any affiliated care institutions. One name recurred with troubling frequency: St. Augustine Behavioral Rehabilitation Center, located 40 minutes south of Hollow Pines. Established in the 1950s, it was a hybrid facility, part mental health institution, part re-education retreat, historically known for accepting patients referred by churches for spiritual realignment or post-trauma sanctification. That vague language didn't sit right with Mason. The building had once been a monastery itself before being converted in the early 80s, and it shared more than a few names on its board of trustees, with St. Mary's own leadership, including the late Bishop Edgar Whelan, and, to Mason's dismay, Father Gerald Kane. On a rainy Wednesday afternoon, Mason made the drive to the center, posing as a distant relative researching family history. At the front desk, A tight-lipped receptionist informed him that all medical records older than 10 years had been moved off-site for digital archiving. She handed him a business card for the storage contractor now handling the center's archive materials, Hudson Secure Records, a regional firm located just outside of Albany. That night, Mason drafted an email to Hudson posing as a graduate student requesting information for a historical research project. He included as much vague credentialing as he could forge, then waited. 2 days later, a reply arrived. Yes, Hudson Secure did possess documents pertaining to St. Augustine Behavioral Rehabilitation Center from 2009 to 2015. Retrieval of any specific file would require a patient name and approximate date of admission. He hesitated before typing. Then he entered, Camilla Hargrove, female, admitted between 2008 and 2012. The response came within 20 minutes. A file was found. The record, though incomplete due to water damage during a facility flood in 2017, referenced a patient matching the name Camilla Hargrove, admitted on March 13, 2011. The record noted transfer from an unspecified religious site, no prior medical history on file, diagnosis marked as delusional disorder with religious fixation. The file also included a treatment note indicating the patient terminus to Latin hymns with distress, and demonstrates aversion to cruciform imagery. Mason's stomach turned. There was no listed discharge date. Under physician notes, a brief comment stood out. Patient speaks in fragments, frequently mentions chains, water, purification, indicates a ritual context. Facility chaplain recommends continuation of sanctified isolation. Mason arranged to visit Hudson in person. Upon arrival, he was led through narrow halls stacked with towering metal shelves filled with decaying cardboard. The archivist handed him the thin manila folder marked Hargrove, Camilla. Inside, much had indeed been destroyed by water, but what remained painted a clearer picture. There were no contact records, no next of kin, no insurance. One intake note, however, included a chilling statement. Referral sourced from private diocese tax contact. No digital trail. It also listed a code, PRT9. Mason didn't recognize it, but it appeared on other files nearby, always on female patients, always sourced through similar ecclesiastical channels. A keyword search in the index system prior to arrival was simply marked as Providence. That word set alarms off in his head. St. Mary of Providence. It wasn't just a name, it had been a code, a gatekeeper, an off-the-books feeder system into institutions that were designed to silence, not to heal. He snapped photos of everything he could before being escorted out of the facility. That night, he returned to his workshop and pulled out Sister Margaret's journal again, reading it now with a new lens. A line he had once skimmed now made horrific sense. They say Augustine is the next phase. If the rites fail, the mind must be made still. He began mapping connections between former convent personnel and the treatment center. 5 names overlapped, 2 medical staff, 1 counselor, and 2 spiritual advisors. All had past associations with St. Mary's or nearby parishes. Mason created a spreadsheet identifying known survivors, gaps in timelines, admission logs. A sickening pattern emerged. Every 3 to 6 years, a woman would be admitted under dubious circumstances, left with no official medical history, and discharged quietly, if at all. Mason tried to contact one former patient listed in the archives as AA, admitted in 2010. The address on file belonged to a halfway home in Syracuse. He called the number. It rang 4 times before a voice answered. A woman, cautious, quiet. He introduced himself, said he was researching treatment history, and before he could finish, she said, "Did she send you?" He froze. "Who?" "Camilla," the woman whispered, then hung up. Mason sat, staring at the dead phone in his hand. The pieces were falling into place too perfectly. The convent hadn't just hidden Camilla, they had systematically erased her, moved her from sacred walls to padded ones, passed her like a secret across a network that dressed abuse in the language of faith. The records, the rituals, the coded terminology, it was all part of a pipeline no one outside the church had dared question. The next morning, Mason drove to St. Augustine's again, but this time he didn't go in. He circled the perimeter, parked near the rear fence line, and waited. At 2:45 p.m., a gray SUV pulled into the loading bay and two men in plain clothes unloaded boxes marked RAA. One of them, a man with thick glasses and thinning blonde hair, looked up toward Mason's van and paused. Mason recognized him. He had seen the same man in a photo from the old Convent files, back when he wore a white collar and stood next to Gerald Kane during a retreat in 1997. Now he was here, unbadged, unannounced, watching. The man Mason saw unloading boxes near the rear of St. Augustine's was unmistakably Father Ronald Tierney, though he no longer wore the clerical collar that once defined him. Tierney had served as assistant director at St. Mary of Providence in the late 90s, eventually becoming its acting head by 2005 after a brief diocesan reshuffle. Official records claimed he retired in 2009 due to health complications. But internal notes Mason had dug up suggested something else entirely. Tierney had been placed on leave during a quiet investigation into irregularities in the administration of rites. Those words, buried in a church memo, had stayed with Mason since he first read them, and now, seeing the man alive, active, and connected to St. Augustine's, a facility tied to a pipeline of silence, cemented a truth too disturbing to ignore. Mason snapped photos from the van, capturing Tierney's face, the SUV's plates, and the boxes. But more than evidence, what he needed now was motive, admission, or something that proved this was not just a series of overlooked accidents. It was time to go back to the origin. That night, he returned to the shelter after hours under the cover of darkness. He didn't head straight to the basement this time. Instead, he went up, climbing the creaky back stairwell to the third floor, long since deemed unsafe and restricted. With gloves on, he forced open the warped door to the old administrative wing, dust clouding the stale air. The hallway was lined with faded religious paintings and corkboards filled with curling announcements from decades past. He found the records room at the end of the corridor, its door sealed with a broken chain that had clearly been left that way for years. Inside, steel filing cabinets lined the walls, some toppled from age or prior ransacking. Rats had chewed through some folders, but others remained sealed, tagged with yellowed labels and brittle red tape. He rifled through drawers until he found one marked Internal, marked 2008211. The folders were sparse, but a small stack bore Tierney's name. As he read through them, a narrative emerged: requests for reassignments, memos from diocese's auditors, and one flagged letter, handwritten, never mailed. It was dated February 17, 2010, addressed to Bishop Whalen, but never officially received. Its contents stopped Mason cold. I could no longer lie to God, to my own conscience, nor to the veil of ceremony we have stretched over our sins. What we have done in the name of obedience, we have done with bloodied hands. Camilla Hargrove was the last. I watched her descend, and I closed the door. She begged. I walked away. When I returned, days later, she had gone. I do not know if she escaped or was removed, but I never saw her again. And I never asked, because to ask would be to break the contract of silence that holds this place together. What we did was not purification, it was desecration. May God have mercy on us. I cannot bear it any longer. Signed simply, R.T. Beneath the signature was a faint ink blot, likely from hesitation, trembling hands, or something else. Mason folded the letter carefully and stored it in a plastic sleeve. This was it, a confession, however veiled, from one of the architects of the rites. But there was more. Stuffed behind the drawer, as if fallen Beijing An, was a leather-bound day planner. Inside were scribbled notations, mostly schedule logs, appointment times, and initials, until one stood out. Oct 16, 2008, Matt Farwalker, scheduled TH next to it. Ensure compliance, Father G, present, Tierney, to seal. Mason closed the planner and leaned back on the dusty floor, heart pounding. Tierney had recorded everything and had vanished from public view only a year later. Mason's research revealed that in July 2010, Tierney was officially listed as missing after failing to return from a scheduled retreat in Vermont. His car had been found near a lake, keys inside, but no body, no sign of foul play. The case had been closed as presumed suicide, but now that story no longer held weight. If Tierney had written a confession, If he had been involved in covering up Camilla's fate, then his disappearance might not have been a death. It might have been a removal. Mason's mind spun with possibility. He left the records room and descended to the second floor, carefully avoiding the creaking boards. There, hidden beneath an altar in a long unused prayer room, he pried loose a floor panel where old altar wine had once been stored. Inside was a locked box, water-damaged but intact. He forced it open with his crowbar and found a bundle of rolled papers, architectural lay prints, the original layout of the convent, as built in 1947. These plans showed a far different structure than what existed now. No sub-basement, no isolated chamber, no stairwell under the boiler room. Those had been added later, unpermitted, unrecorded. The timelines matched exactly, with Father Gerald Kane's rise in authority over the convent. The final document was a hand-drawn floor plan dated 2007, marked ORG Perigien. It listed penitent quarters, observation chamber, and something labeled Locus Silence. The place of silence, the blueprints had a signature in the corner, Frank Mason. Took photos of every page, backing up each image to class storage and a flash drive. As he packed his gear, the storm outside intensified. Thunder cracked, shaking the brittle glass windows. On his way out, he passed the hallway where the chapel had once opened into a garden. Now boarded over, the space was barely accessible, but something about the door, the way it stood slightly ajar, pulled at him. He entered and found a room untouched by time. Candles, long since burned out, still lined the altar. The scent of dust and dried incense lingered. In the center, a small wooden box rested on a kneeler. It contained nothing but a rosary and a photograph. Camilla, eyes open, faintly smiling, standing beside Tierney in front of a large oak door Mason now recognized from the sub-chamber. Scribbled on the back in hurried pencil, "She forgave me. I never deserved it." As he stood to leave, his phone buzzed. It was an email, no subject, no sender. Attached was a single JPEG file, security camera footage. Grainy, timestamp from 4 nights ago. Mason's blood froze. The clip showed a woman in a hooded coat entering the back gate of the shelter, bypassing the keypad, descending the stairs. She moved with purpose, and just before she vanished from frame, she looked directly into the lens. Her face was blurry, but unmistakable. Mason zoomed in. The eyes. The mouth. It was Camilla. The grainy footage haunted Mason for days. He watched the clip over and over, pausing at each frame, zooming into the woman's face, tracing her features in disbelief. The timestamp was 4 nights ago, the same night he had been in the chamber beneath the boiler room retrieving Sister Margaret's confession. That meant she had been there too, in the building, watching, or possibly even passing him by undetected. But how? How could someone presumed dead for over a decade simply reappear and disappear again, like smoke? Mason needed answers, and he began where all questions in Hollow Pines seemed to loop back. The shelter. He returned that afternoon and sat quietly in the cafeteria of the small conversations that never reached above a whisper. But one woman, thin, weathered, with deeply set eyes and a way of sitting that felt both deliberate and cautious, watched him. She said nothing at first, simply observed as Mason spoke with the staff, drank his coffee, and waited. Then, as he was about to leave, she stood and followed. Outside, near the side garden that had once been part of the convent's original grounds, she spoke. "You've been downstairs," she said, voice hoarse from disuse. Or something deeper. Mason turned. "Excuse me?" "The room," she clarified, eyes narrowing. "The one they sealed. You've been there." He studied her face. There was something in her gaze that pierced through years. Pain, confusion. He nodded. "Who are you?" She looked around, then motioned toward the alley behind the kitchen. They walked in silence until they reached the back wall of the property, shielded from view. Then she spoke again. "My name used to be Sister Camilla Hargrove." Mason's breath caught. He stared at her, heart thundering. "Used to be?" She nodded. They erased it. "The day they took me from the chamber, they drugged me. Injections daily. Told me I'd sinned, that the voices were lies, that the memories weren't real." She looked away, voice trembling. "But I remembered, even when the drugs blurred my thoughts. I kept one thing in my head, over and over, my name. I whispered it to myself at night, in the dark, under blankets, inside walls. Camilla. Mason felt dizzy. You were at St. Augustine? She nodded. They called it reform, but it was just another version of the basement. Isolation, control. Once a week, I was allowed to walk the courtyard. That's when I met Annette. She didn't talk at first, just stared at the ground, but eventually she told me she had come from another convent. Same stories, same rites. Camilla closed her eyes. There were 4 of us in total, all brought in after failed purifications, all marked incomplete. Mason stepped closer. What happened to them? Her voice dropped. Annette tried to escape. They found her in the laundry chute. She broke her neck. Another girl, Teresa, went catatonic after a forced session with Father Gerald. She stopped eating, died within weeks. The third? She hesitated. Marielle. They said she attacked a staff member. They restrained her. She never came back. Just me. Just one. Mason couldn't speak. Every piece, every document, every whispered name now had a face, a voice. Why come back now? He asked. Camilla looked up at the convent silhouette against the sky. Because it's open again. Because someone is digging. Because I thought maybe, just maybe, the truth would find light if I watched long enough. Her eyes met his. You went where no one else dared. You opened the path. Mason felt his throat tighten. I didn't know what I'd find. Neither did I, she whispered. But now you do, and now they'll know too. She pulled something from her coat, a crumpled envelope, worn from age. This was supposed to be mailed to my brother. I kept it hidden for years. Inside were pages from her own hand, letters, prayers, confessions written on napkins, paper scraps, even the back of medication labels. Mason read quickly, seeing phrases she'd repeated in the journals beneath the convent. They think pain purifies. They think silence is obedience. They never saw the fire in me. At the bottom of one page, dated 2014, was a list of names. Annette, Teresa, Marielle, and Camilla, circled twice. I need you to testify, Mason said, to speak out. She shook her head. I can't. Not like this. If they know I'm alive, they'll find a way to silence me again. I've seen how they erase not just names, but people. She hesitated. But I know where they keep the rest. The ledgers. The logs from all the girls. Mason leaned in. Where? Camilla looked back toward the old storage wing. There's a crawl space, 2nd floor, behind the infirmary closet. It was only used by staff. They hid things there, things even the diocese didn't want copied. He stared at her, awe and dread mixing in his chest. Will you come with me? She shook her head. I'll wait, but not for long. You find the Monas, and we may connect to know I survived. Mason turned to go, heart pounding. Bull-headed evidence, a witness, and now a map to the records that could burn the whole system down. But as he reached the corner of the alley, he looked back. She was gone. By dawn the next day, Mason had already returned to the shelter and stood in front of the closet Camilla described. The infirmary wing had long been sealed off, deemed obsolete during renovations. He pried open the door with a crowbar and stepped into the dusk-heavy air, brushing past cobwebs and peeling wallpaper. Behind the metal cabinet, he found a sheet of plywood screwed directly into the plaster wall. Using a drill he smuggled in under his coat, Mason removed the screws and pushed through to reveal a narrow crawl space. It was barely wide enough for him to fit, but he shuffled forward on his elbows, flashlight clenched between his teeth. 10 feet in, the space widened slightly into a small compartment, no larger than a supply closet, lined with old cardboard banker boxes and a rusted filing cabinet. He flipped open one of the boxes and found them immediately. Original penance logs, hand-sitten schedules of rituals, intake forms from the diocese stamped classified Ordo S. Purgateo. The names matched those in Camilla's notes. He saw not only Annette, Teresa, and Marielle, but dozens more, some marked released, others unconfirmed. One sheet documented a financial disbursement dated February 2012, $140,000, 0 cents labeled for reconstruction and legal closure. Another page listed names next to 5-digit codes and bank accounts registered in Delaware. Payments varied, some as high as $80,000, 0 cents, others $10,000, 0 cents, likely for silence, erasure, relocation. Mason took photos of everything. He didn't stop to read it all. He knew there wasn't time. That morning, while he was still inside, trucks arrived outside the shelter. Lorraine had returned, and with her came a demolition crew and a site supervisor. Their instructions: reinforce the basement, pour concrete over the boiler room, and seal all access to unsafe foundation anomalies. Mason heard the jackhammers begin above him. They were erasing it, just like Camilla warned. But he was ready. That afternoon, Mason delivered a USB drive containing every file, photo, scanned document, and journal excerpt to the office of a small but fearless newspaper in Albany. The editor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s named Evelyn Ward, had spent decades exposing corruption in religious and municipal systems. When she saw the footage, read the letters, and reviewed Camilla's testimony, she didn't hesitate. "Go live with this in 72 hours, she told her staff. "No advance notice, no legal heads-up. We publish and prepare for the war." By Sunday morning, the headline broke across the Northeast: "Church of Silence, Inside the Rituals Hidden Below St. Mary's Convent." The article featured direct quotes from the chamber and the scanned letter from Father Tierney. National outlets picked it up within hours. Social media exploded. By that evening, the Bishop of Albany issued a press release stating that the diocese was deeply troubled by the allegations and promised a full internal review. But Mason knew that was just posturing. He had given them more than they could ignore. The next day, a group of construction workers at the shelter refused to pour the final foundation after one of them, a young man named Jose, claimed he heard a voice whispering prayers behind the sealed basement door. "I don't mess with ghosts, man," he said on camera, sparking viral headlines. Camilla remained hidden, watching from a distance. Mason kept her updated via drop points, old P.O. boxes, and handwritten notes passed through trusted intermediaries. Her safety came first, but even with her hidden, the story had grown too large to contain. Former patients came forward. One by one, women in their 50s and 60s contacted Evelyn Ward's newsroom. Some remembered pieces, others had journals, letters, or matching scars. Lawsuits began to mount. 2 weeks later, state investigators launched an official inquiry into the Hollow Pines Diocese. The Attorney General ordered a full excavation of the shelter grounds. The concrete was jackhammered back open, this time under forensic supervision. Beneath the floor, in the same chamber Mason had discovered, they found shackles embedded in concrete, DNA samples on fabric, and traces of human hair embedded in rusted drain covers. It was real, all of it. Lorraine DeWitt resigned abruptly. No charges were filed against her, but leaked emails revealed she had received more than $45,000, 0 cents in operational reimbursements from diocesan's discretionary accounts. Father Gerald Kane disappeared from public view. No one could confirm if he had left the country or vanished by other means. Father Tierney's body was never recovered, but his words, his confession, burned through every courtroom, every headline, every pulpit that tried to deny the truth. Camilla remained silent to the public. She never gave an interview, never showed her face on television, but through Mason, she submitted one final statement: what they tried to bury was never dead. It was screaming, breathing, praying for someone to listen. Thank you for listening. The room beneath St. Mary's was sealed a second time, this time not in shame, but as evidence. The convent itself was declared a historical crime site. The town of Hollow Pines, once sleepy and indifferent, had become the epicenter of a reckoning that reached into every corner of clerical silence. Mason returned to his workshop. He placed the final copies of every document into a locked drawer, labeled only with one word: Camilla. Then, with quiet hands, he picked up the original journal, the first one he found, and turned to the very first page, where a simple line had once been scribbled in haste: "They think no one will come, but someone always does." Mason closed the book gently, stood, and stepped outside into the cool evening light, where the wind carried the echo of prayers once whispered through concrete walls, now returned to the air, finally heard. If this story pulled you in, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Did any moment truly shock you? What do you think was the most disturbing detail? Let me know in the comments and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel.